My grandfather had a major heart attack in his 40s, and I've always been told
You're at increased risk.
heart disease isn't just an issue for my family, though. Cardiovascular disease is the #1 killer globally. Even if you don't think you're at risk of heart disease, the latest research indicates that chances are, by mid-age, you'll have plaquing. This is a quote from the most high-tech study available right now. 63% of the asymptomatic patients, average of 46 years, so middle age, showed evidence of plaquing in the arteries. And the latest research shows how to reduce that risk of death tremendously. See the description box below for links to the peer-reviewed journal articles, the gold standard in science. But there's a special challenge to teaching this emerging data. This channel can't just tell you the answers and then move on. For your entire life, your doctors and your science teachers have taught you to focus on lower-level risk factors that probably won't even matter once you make more important changes in your lifestyle. They did it with the best of intentions, but now you have strong beliefs about what you've been taught. We all tend to reject information that conflicts with our beliefs. This is true even when we see scientific proof that we were wrong. If you're curious about this topic, you can click the video above for more information about how we have such a difficult time accepting things that conflict with our prior beliefs. For example, since the 60s and 70s, governments have been telling people,
Avoid eating very much cholesterol. It'll give you a heart attack.
Then beginning in 2015, we started seeing drafts of U.S. nutritional guidelines stating that cholesterol is no longer a nutrient of concern. Yet final drafts of those same guidelines have always returned to the recommendation that we eat as little cholesterol as possible. These kinds of views are like a gigantic ship that takes decades to turn. Because of the momentum of long-held beliefs stemming from advice from the people that you trusted the most,
You can trust me.
you'll have to understand the newer studies to truly believe them. If you don't truly understand these newer studies, you probably won't take the steps necessary to save the people you love and yourself. In fact, if you don't understand, chances are you'll follow the traditional recommendations, which newer studies show are increasing the likelihood that you'll die younger. If there's only one scientific video you ever watch all the way to the end, or even rewatch to ensure that you truly understand it, this might be the best one. It's about what can save you and your loved ones from the #1 killer. Let's save some lives. I wish I could tell you how heart disease works. Lots of doctors have videos about the internal workings of our bodies as if it's a known science. The truth is, we don't really know what's going on. For the most part, we review study results and guess at what's happening inside of us. Newer studies come out showing that our old guesses were wrong, and so we guess again. Our bodies are complicated far beyond our current abilities to understand. When I was small, doctors prescribed antibiotics all the time. Doctors had no idea that these antibiotics destroyed the bacteria living inside of our guts, many of which were very important. Now we think that brought about many kinds of illnesses, from digestive issues to issues with our mental health. Even if we don't know everything that's going on inside of our bodies, it's important to model what that might be so that we can test our guesses. That's why we're going to review what we think the mechanism is that's causing heart disease. The most common form of heart disease is when cholesterol sticks to the inside of our arteries. That cholesterol forms a plaque. When that plaque ruptures, it tends to cause a blood clot. If that blood clot blocks flow to the heart, we call it a heart attack. And if it blocks flow to the brain, it's a stroke. One way of fighting against heart disease is to reduce the cholesterol in your blood. So you might stop eating as much saturated fat, or you might take a pill that reduces cholesterol called a statin. A very different way of fighting heart disease is to eliminate the things that are causing the cholesterol to form a plaque in the arteries, to stick to the arteries. Arguably, that's the better solution since our bodies need cholesterol in many ways. For example, you might not know, but cholesterol creates the outer coating of every cell in our bodies. It is debatable how much cholesterol our bodies actually need, but it's not debatable that if we don't have cholesterol, our bodies are in bad shape. Since we're studying heart disease, we should understand why cholesterol is flowing through our blood. Of course, that's how we get the cholesterol to the many parts of our body that need it. The more relevant purpose, though, is that cholesterol-carrying particles in our blood act as band-aids for our arteries. The problem is when those band-aids build up too much. When they build up too much, They're forming plaques. Various factors cause our cholesterol-carrying particles to stick to our arteries too much. As you've probably heard, smoking does this. Drinking may also do it a little, but most importantly, metabolic syndrome does this. Metabolic syndrome is when your body can't process blood sugar right. You get it when you're unhealthy, like when you eat too many of the things that spike your blood sugar, like eating too much processed carbohydrates or too much sugar. Symptoms include extra fat on the body, high triglycerides, low HDL, insulin resistance, and even diabetes. Why do we think that metabolic syndrome makes our arteries and our cholesterol-carrying particles too sticky? Here are some of the reasons. Studies show that plaque development is essentially an inflammatory process. We build up plaque when our bodies think our arteries need to be healed. Other studies show that people with metabolic syndrome have smaller, denser cholesterol-carrying particles in their blood, as if they're damaged in some way. And these small, dense cholesterol-carrying particles are more indicative of heart disease than cholesterol is alone. The small, dense particles seem to stick more easily to our arteries, stay in our bloodstream longer, increasing our cholesterol count, and are damaged more easily. Here's the real problem, and the reason you're probably watching this video. A low-carb, high-saturated fat diet is often considered one of the best ways of addressing various health concerns, including metabolic syndrome. But that diet sometimes increases cholesterol and cholesterol-carrying particles in the blood. Many low-carb dieters see a spike in their cholesterol even if they avoid saturated fat. So what should you do? Time to look at some studies. Many of these studies came out just in the last few years, which hasn't given medical beliefs much time to shift, especially given how slowly you would expect them to shift in a situation like this. Let's start with a 2021 analysis of the most expensive study ever. It's an observational study, which means it's not a tightly controlled clinical trial. There are many potential sources of error in this kind of study. And because of that, this sort of study is only meaningful if you see correlations that are very, very large in magnitude. Often hundreds or even thousands of % increases are the only correlations that are meaningful. Correlations of even tens of % are often misleading. The specific heart disease study I'm referring to is better than most other observational studies. The researchers followed a lot of people, about 28,000 women, for a long time, about 21 years each. That allowed the researchers to see what kinds of conditions led to heart disease. Many other observational studies have much worse designs. They might not involve as many people, or they might just look at what people are currently doing that brought about the disease instead of looking at what they had done before that was probably more of a factor that brought that disease about. After all, it's what we've done over the last many years that often brings about who we are today. Or these worse studies might rely on people remembering all the things that they ate or did over the course of many years, and that's not very accurate. This very expensive, fairly good observational study looked at the many things that go into bringing about early heart disease. Studying what causes early heart disease is especially telling. It's hard to tell what brings about heart disease in an 80-year-old. An 80-year-old has probably changed numerous of his or her life factors over the course of that very long lifespan. For example, a person might try several different kinds of diets. So instead of looking at what brings about heart disease over a long span of time, which can be somewhat misleading, we're going to look at what brings about heart disease quickly. Fast-building plaquing is more telling of what brings about heart disease. So, what factors were bringing about early heart disease according to this study? Having high cholesterol increased risk by about 40%. That's barely measurable for this kind of observational study. Having high ApoB, a more accurate measure of the number of cholesterol-carrying particles in the blood, increased risk by 90%. That's almost a doubling of risk. Smoking increased risk by 290%. Now we're seeing the kinds of numbers this kind of study is designed to measure. Metabolic syndrome increased risk by 510%. And diabetes, which is essentially advanced metabolic syndrome, increased risk by 970%. This isn't the only study showing this trend, but it's arguably the best. This has helped virtually everyone who's following the recent literature agree. Metabolic syndrome and smoking are the biggest factors in bringing about heart disease. Cholesterol is not the largest factor. This kind of study brings into question whether cholesterol is something we should be worrying about at all. The study design is only really for picking up huge magnitude changes in risk, like we see with metabolic syndrome. Advanced metabolic dysfunction increased risk by almost 1,000%. Cholesterol increased risk by tens of %. If you'd like to learn more about these kinds of observational studies, their limitations, their advantages, and why so many people are confused by them, you might want to watch the video by clicking the link above. So, is cholesterol even worth worrying about? Currently, the best-selling heart health book on Amazon is by a heart surgeon who eats a carnivore diet, meaning exclusively meat, packed with saturated fat. He likes to point out that half the people admitted to the hospital for heart and stroke problems have normal or low cholesterol. I'll say that again. Half the people who get into the hospital because of their heart problems have normal or low cholesterol. That would suggest the amount of cholesterol isn't a very important factor in bringing about heart problems. That would also suggest the important factor is whether your cholesterol or your cholesterol-carrying particles are sticking to your arteries too easily. For example, the amount of HDL, a marker for metabolic syndrome, was present in 90% of these people who were checking into the hospital for heart problems. The carnivore heart surgeon who pointed this out was in a recent debate about eating saturated fat. The person arguing for the traditional view said,
We can't learn much from the fact that half the people hospitalized for heart problems have lower normal cholesterol.
we can't learn very much because people's cholesterol levels drop after they have a heart attack. And he's right. This is the 1993 study that proved it. It shows that about 24 hours after the beginning of a heart problem, people's cholesterol numbers dropped precipitously, and then they gradually rise back up again over the course of the next couple months. So taking people's cholesterol readings maybe a day after a heart attack would be very misleading. The person with the traditional view also said this.
The low cholesterol of many heart attack victims is misleading because many of them are on statins, cholesterol-lowering drugs. Their cholesterol may be low now, but it wasn't over their lifetimes before they started taking statins.
He was arguing that these people on statins have heart attacks because of the cholesterol that used to be flowing through their blood. It's fairly well accepted that it takes decades for soft plaquing to decrease significantly. Well, a recent 2021 study looked at exactly these arguments. A hospital took the readings of people who had had heart events, heart problems, but only considered those people who got their readings within 24 hours of the beginning of that heart event. That means these cholesterol readings wouldn't be affected by the decrease in cholesterol that we see occur 24 hours after a heart event. In fact, on average, these readings were taken about 6 hours after these people's heart attacks or other heart events. These readings should be accurate. The hospital study also only considered people who are not on cholesterol-lowering drugs. That means medications shouldn't have affected the accuracy of these readings either. And the result was the same. Most of the people admitted did not have high cholesterol. Instead, the low cholesterol heart attack victims had an increased marker for inflammation. That suggests the stickiness, not the amount of cholesterol, was the main issue. Our focus should be on metabolic dysfunction and the other things that cause our cholesterol-carrying particles and our vessels to be too sticky. The debater who argued for lowering cholesterol had a backup argument. He said,
The heart attack victims that had normal or low cholesterol were people who need to keep their cholesterol especially low. We should try to keep cholesterol as low as possible, even if there are no other risk factors.
In support of his argument, he brought up a high-tech Spanish study. This high-tech Spanish study is a very good one, by the way. A 2017 paper from the Spanish study looked at people who had plaque buildup even without metabolic syndrome risk factors. That means these study participants weren't insulin resistant, etc. Yet some of those people had plaque buildup even when their cholesterol was fairly low or normal. And the amount of that plaque buildup increased with the amount of cholesterol in that person's blood. The researchers concluded that people may need to keep their cholesterol as low as possible, even if there are no other risk factors. This was seemingly strong evidence for the debater who said that cholesterol is still an important risk factor.
Metabolic syndrome and smoking might be the biggest factors, but I think we still need to pay attention to cholesterol.
That debater from the traditional view failed to mention the 2021 follow-up review from those same researchers in the same high-tech Spanish study. The newer paper restated the 2017 paper's findings, but then the newer paper offered what could be considered an alternate explanation. Under their alternate view, cholesterol may not be important for people who are otherwise very healthy. This alternate view also matched more evidence, and so arguably the alternate view is the better view. The authors said that heart disease and plaquing correlates especially closely with evidence of metabolic syndrome and the damage done to these cholesterol-carrying particles. Here's the quote from that alternate view. You can pause the video and read it if you'd like, but it's a bit difficult to wade through, so we won't force everyone to read through it together. Most importantly, the researchers noticed that an increase in damaged cholesterol-carrying particles appears to be the first sign of metabolic syndrome, occurring before the other early signs. Here's the quote. These data suggest that elevated plasma, OX-LDL, meaning damaged cholesterol-carrying particles, may be a predictor of metabolic syndrome, reflecting a core mechanism through which metabolic syndrome components develop and progress in the absence of central obesity and before the appearance of insulin resistance. In other words, the people who had plaque buildup in the absence of other risk factors may have just been in the early stages of metabolic syndrome. That would mean metabolic syndrome is the problem. We shouldn't conclude cholesterol is bad even at low levels. We should conclude that damaged cholesterol is bad even at low levels. We shouldn't conclude that increased cholesterol correlates with increased risk of heart disease. We should conclude that damaged cholesterol and inflammation correlate with increased risk. That leaves us with two theories. The first is what you might call the new traditional theory, and that is that
metabolic syndrome is an important factor, but cholesterol is an important factor as well, even if you're healthy.
The second theory is that metabolic dysfunction is the major problem, along with other things that make our cholesterol and arteries too sticky because of damage. And cholesterol in people who are otherwise healthy isn't really a problem. So how can we tell which theory is correct? We can look at brand new research regarding people who are very metabolically healthy and have sky-high LDL cholesterol. Fair warning, this research is not in a published paper yet. It almost certainly will be in about a month, but what we're looking at now is data that was presented at a conference in September of 2023. The presenter was Dave Feldman, someone who's published other papers on low-carb dieting and the effects on cholesterol. This particular study is designed to look at people who went on a very low carbohydrate diet, got very metabolically healthy, and then saw their cholesterol counts go way, way up, far higher than what we'd normally consider high cholesterol. The point of this study is to view these people's plaque to see whether it goes up or goes down while they're on this diet and have that sky-high cholesterol. For low-carb dieters, this is an important study. If this study shows that these low-carb dieters build up new plaque, then that would suggest that this low-carb diet may be dangerous. Virtually everyone agrees plaque buildup is what causes the vast majority of heart attacks and strokes. On the other hand, if their plaque levels stay the same or even go down, low-carb diets are good for heart health regardless of cholesterol readings. The study has just begun. So far, the study has just taken the initial readings of the people who've agreed to participate. But these initial plaque readings have been meaningful, so they're going to be published in a study even before the study has been concluded. These initial plaque readings are meaningful because these study participants have already been on their diets for about 4.5 years on average. That means these people's plaque levels can be compared to people who are in the normal population to see whether these people's 4 years on this diet, which has caused great metabolic health, but also very high levels of cholesterol, has either increased or decreased their plaquing. The high-tech Spanish study showed that people's plaquing in even a normal population can build up noticeably in just 3 years. The Spanish study also stated that a person's risk of heart problems and presumably their plaquing continues to go up as a person's cholesterol increases. So if the traditional view about cholesterol is correct, these study participants who have been on a healthy diet in terms of metabolic syndrome that has resulted in very high cholesterol readings over 4.5 years should see far higher plaque levels in their arteries than the average person. Actually, the initial readings showed that these people had less plaquing than normal. Being on a diet that was metabolically very healthy and increased cholesterol greatly seems to have been good for heart health. We'll know more in coming years. They're going to continue monitoring those people's plaque levels, but it seems the diet is heart healthy even if it causes very high cholesterol. There are other published studies suggesting that people who eat a low-carbohydrate diet are at slightly increased risk of death from heart attack. But they have a glaring set of common defects. First, they're observational studies that make conclusions based on small percentage risks. If you're familiar with this topic from some of our other videos, feel free to skip ahead to this time code. As already discussed, observational studies need to show a very large percentage change in risk in order to be meaningful. Small percentages are often from expected sources of error. These studies suffer from one particularly large source of error.
That would be me.
People from the West, meaning people from the United States and European-descended countries, have been told for a long time, decades, generations, that
Eating meat is unhealthy.
studies show that belief has become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Since people from those countries believe meat is unhealthy, health-conscious people from those countries tend not to eat very much meat. More importantly, people from those countries who eat a lot of meat tend to be less health conscious. Heavy meat eaters are more likely to smoke, less likely to exercise, more likely to take steroids, more likely to eat sweets and become diabetic, etc. Each one of those factors increases the likelihood of getting heart disease or of dying by hundreds of %. So it's no surprise that observational studies from these countries, meaning America and European-descended countries, show an increased risk of heart disease and early death from people who engage in higher meat diets. But studies that look elsewhere provide very different results. The best source of information on this topic is probably UN agency data. According to 2023 UN agency data, the longest-lived region with over 40,000 people that they track is Hong Kong. And 2023 UN agency data shows that Hong Kong eats the most meat in the world per capita. They eat a lot of pork there, which is very high in saturated fat. The second longest-lived UN agency region in the world is Macau, and per person, they happen to be the third largest consumers of meat in the entire world. You can see the trend forming. The self-fulfilling prophecy about eating meat and becoming unhealthy doesn't hold true in other countries beyond the West where they don't follow that belief. Parts of Asia are certainly affected by Western beliefs, but not as pervasively. A group of Australian researchers studied this after noticing the recent trend of criticizing meat-related observational studies. In the author's words, the association between a plant-based diet, vegetarianism, and extended lifespan is increasingly criticized since it may be based on the lack of representative data and insufficient removal of confounders such as lifestyles. Confounders would be sources of error. In 2022, these researchers from Australia published a paper by looking at UN agency data for lifespan and meat consumption for virtually the entire world. This is quite possibly the best study of its kind. By looking at the entire world, it helped eliminate biases based upon region. UN agency data is also gathered in ways that are arguably more reliable than most other studies. Most other studies ask people to fill out questionnaires about the amount of meat they think they ate over the course of the last period of time. Those kinds of questionnaires have proven to be highly inaccurate, especially where people think that they're going to be judged a certain way based upon how they respond. Even in anonymous questionnaires, people report what they think they should be eating instead of what they actually are eating. This 2022 Australian study is also arguably better because it looked at virtually the entire world for many years. Generally, the larger the data set, the more accurate it becomes, and you can't really have a larger data set than the entire world over many years. The outcome of this study was a clear trend. The more meat people ate, the longer they lived. And this was true even after making statistical adjustments for various expected sources of bias, meaning whether people were obese, had enough food, their education levels, etc. As you've probably gleaned, this Australian study was not alone in making this kind of a finding. For example, peer-reviewed journal articles show the same sort of trend with respect to low-carb diet patterns in the East. This is especially true for meat-heavy low-carb diets. Think the Atkins diet or maybe the Carnivore diet. Observational studies of these kinds of diets from the West, meaning America and European-descended countries, tend to show increased risk of heart attack and early death, though only a small amount.
Not surprising. My friends and I were each about 100 pounds overweight before we went on the carnivore diet. That's why we went on the diet. We were walking heart attacks.
Now let's compare these low-carb studies from the West to low-carb studies in the East. In 2022, Chinese researchers published 2 papers on low-carb diet trends and how they affect longevity in China. All the study participants were patients at hospitals in the city of Guangzhou, China. That's a relatively wealthy and very large city in China. Interestingly, the people who ate a low-carb diet heavy in plants were at a 16% increased risk of death. The people who ate a low-carb diet heaviest in meat and saturated fat were at a decreased risk of death. The statistics were even more pronounced when looking at deaths from heart disease. Heavy plant eaters were at a 58% increased risk of dying of heart disease versus heavy meat eaters. The companion study on stroke showed essentially the same thing. The people who ate a diet lowest in carbohydrate and highest in saturated fat were the least likely to die of strokes. It's important to note that many of the people in this study weren't eating what many people in the West would consider a low-carbohydrate diet. In fact, many of them were eating diets that had more than 50% of calories coming from carbohydrates. People were grouped based upon comparisons with each other, not based upon certain carb thresholds. The people in the lowest 25% simply ate fewer carbohydrates than everybody else. That said, we see that these low-carb observational studies in the United States or the East, those are heavily influenced by those people's beliefs in whether meat is healthy or unhealthy. Let's summarize what we've learned. Metabolic syndrome and smoking are by far the biggest risk factors. The most expensive and probably best observational study shows this clearly. There's a debate about whether we should worry about cholesterol at all if we're otherwise healthy. Arguably, the best studies suggest that cholesterol is only a problem if our cholesterol-carrying particles or maybe our blood vessels are damaged from an unhealthy lifestyle. The new paper from the high-tech Spanish study leads us to believe this. It was confirmed in the very new research about people who are eating a very low-carb diet and have spiked their cholesterol. We see that those people don't have increased plaquing. And it's confirmed by newer studies that look at the entire world or maybe just the East. In fact, these new studies of the world or the East would suggest that eating a lot of saturated fat actually increases lifespan. So far, we've been considering observational studies. Observational studies are nice because they allow us to study people for longer, but observational studies don't do a very good job of isolating variables and picking up smaller percentage risks. Randomized trials are better for that. Instead of simply observing people, randomized trials give researchers the ability to rule out misleading correlations. So let's look at randomized trials now. In fact, let's start by looking at the most prestigious publication on randomized trials of saturated fat and heart disease. This paper I'm referring to is often cited as proof that the traditional view is still valid, but it probably shouldn't be. The traditional view, of course, is that we need to lower our saturated fat consumption and thus the cholesterol in our blood. This paper represents a pivoting point where the most influential researchers essentially say that that traditional view is weak. The paper I'm referring to is a 2020 Cochrane review. Cochrane reviews are widely considered the best science on a topic. Cochrane is a group related to the UK government. They review virtually all of the papers on a certain topic and then publish a paper with their conclusions. In 2020, Cochrane did this for studies regarding saturated fat, more specifically, randomized trials regarding saturated fat. That paper prominently displays a conclusion that supports the traditional view. Cochrane concluded that eating more saturated fat increases the likelihood of having a heart event. At first, that seems like strong evidence that we should stop eating very much saturated fat. We should try to keep the cholesterol in our blood low to avoid heart attacks, right? But when we look closer at the Cochrane review, we see a shift away from that traditional view. You have to look at the section where Cochrane rates the strength of its conclusions. It rates its most relevant conclusions as very low quality. Here's a quote: "Critical importance. The effect of reducing saturated fat intake on risk of heart attack is unclear, as the evidence is of very low quality." Here's another similar quote: "Critical importance. The effect of reducing saturated fat on the risk of stroke is unclear, as the evidence was of very low quality." Here's yet another quote: "Critical importance. Reducing saturated fat intake probably makes little or no difference to all-cause mortality," meaning how soon we die from any cause. That is, Cochrane doesn't think saturated fat impacts how long we live. What's more, The study participants controlled what they ate, at least to some degree. Generally, the study participants were told what to eat and then sent home, expecting that they would actually eat what they were supposed to. That's the best most of these researchers could hope for, because you can't expect humans to live in a clinical trial that's maybe in a laboratory for a very long period of time. Because these study participants controlled their own diets to some degree, it created at least two sources of very large error. The first of those is bias from people not eating what they're supposed to according to the study. Most of these studies relied on people cooking their own meals in their own homes and simply trying to hit saturated fat targets, maybe more saturated fat or less saturated fat depending upon which group they were assigned to. But in reality, all these people were probably trying to reduce their saturated fat. That's because all the Cochrane trials were from Western countries, where people believed that eating saturated fat was going to kill them. The second kind of bias comes from the placebo effect. When people think they're doing something that's healthy for them, their health actually improves even if they aren't doing something healthy. And it's been proven over and over again. The opposite is also true. If people think they're doing something that's unhealthy, then their health declines. To overcome this, the study participants aren't supposed to know who's receiving the treatment and who's in the control group. So the people in these studies can't know whether they're in the group that's eating the higher saturated fat meals or the lower saturated fat meals. Of all the trials that Cochrane considered, none of them supplied all of the participants meals without telling them which of the groups they were in. Arguably, the best randomized trial was not in the Cochrane review. Let's look at that trial and see why it's possibly the best. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, researchers performed a study on people who were institutionalized at mental health institutions in Minnesota. This was a large randomized trial, almost 10,000 people. The more people, the more accurate the results. Most importantly, it was truly double-blind, which is very hard to achieve in food studies. Neither the people who were serving the meals nor the people who were eating the meals knew who was getting the high saturated fat diet. And the researchers had nearly perfect control over what these people were eating. They controlled the food preparation and they controlled whether the people actually ate it. They could ensure the people ate the meals. Half the patients received a high saturated fat diet. The other half of the patients received a low saturated fat diet in which plant oils replaced fats from animals. As expected, the high saturated fat group had more cholesterol in their blood. Here's what the researchers didn't expect. The higher the cholesterol in the blood, the longer the patients lived. There was a 22% higher risk of death for each 30 milligrams per deciliter of reduced cholesterol. One of the two people running the study was famous, or infamous, by the way. You might have heard of him, Ancel Keys. He's the same person who ran the infamous 7 Nations study. That's the study that basically convinced everyone of the traditional view about saturated fat and cholesterol. I say infamous because he actually had preliminary information on 20-some countries, not 7. Yet he chose those 7 and presented them like they were a randomized assortment of countries to prove his theory. The countries he intentionally excluded did not match his theory. Similar to the countries that he didn't like showing in the 7 Nations study, he didn't publish the Minnesota experiment because it didn't meet what he wanted it to show. Instead, the results of that Minnesota trial remained unpublished for decades. Ancel Keys' decision to stop this Minnesota trial short is also the reason it was not included in the Cochrane review. Had it continued to its conclusion, it almost certainly would have changed the Cochrane review's outcome. That's one of the many reasons why people are starting to say the best science does not support the traditional view. We might actually be better off eating more saturated fat and having more cholesterol as long as we're otherwise healthy. That would explain why people who have a gene for very high cholesterol don't have increased all-cause mortality, meaning they don't live shorter lives. In fact, what is arguably the best study of those people indicates that if they reach the age of 70, they actually have decreased all-cause mortality. They're more likely to live longer. Here's a quote from that study. No significant differences were noted in all-cause mortality between the high cholesterol gene patients and the general Norwegian population, except for a significantly lower risk of death in the age group 70 to 79 years. If you're unhealthy and have high cholesterol, you'll probably die younger, but you may be better off with lots of cholesterol in your blood if you're otherwise healthy. That would explain why higher saturated fat consumption could be weakly associated with heart attacks in some populations, such as in the West, where Almost 80% of the population shows at least some signs of metabolic syndrome. Yet increased saturated fat consumption and increased blood cholesterol don't increase all-cause mortality, meaning our likelihood of dying. In fact, higher saturated fat consumption correlates with longevity in the best studies. The worldwide study, the studies from the East, and the Minnesota trial. And that would explain many of the side effects of statins. Cholesterol-lowering drugs reduce cholesterol of all kinds, including the damaged kind. But reducing our cholesterol seems to have a negative effect on our immune system, our brain function, and many other things. Statins are probably a good idea if you have damaged cholesterol-carrying particles or maybe inflamed arteries. But there's good reason to believe they're harmful as well. If you're nonetheless worried about your cholesterol, remember to exercise in intense bursts. A 2023 paper showed that you can measurably reduce soft plaquing through HIIT in just 6 months. HIIT, or HIIT, means high intensity interval training. You can also monitor your own plaquing. Plaquing is like film on your teeth. The longer it's there, the harder it becomes. Once it's been there for very long, it becomes so hard that it's difficult to remove, maybe even impossible. Exercise only removes the soft variety as far as we know. You can check your levels of hard plaquing very cheaply and easily. You can ask your doctor for a coronary artery calcification scan, or CAC scan. It only costs about $100 to $200. It's the calcified plaquing that's arguably the most dangerous. So this relatively inexpensive test could put your mind at rest about your immediate risk. You can also check your soft levels of plaquing, but that's more expensive. It's often several $1,000s for an appropriate scan. But that might be the best way of monitoring the progression of new plaquing. New plaquing is, after all, soft. And if you're curious whether you should go on a statin, a cholesterol-lowering drug, stay tuned for our next video. Thanks for watching.